constitutional democracy. What groups have used these rights to bring about important changes in American political and civic life? What limitations, if any, might government place on these rights, and how can they be justified? You may begin.
In the U.S., the right to assemble, petition, and associate are essential to be an active, critical citizen. Linda R. Monk stated in her book, The Words We Live By, quote, "The 5 freedoms listed in the First Amendment enable citizens to participate in the process of self-government," unquote. The First Amendment gives us, the people in this country, the power of popular sovereignty.
Historically, the right to petition has been embedded since before the nation was formed. The right to petition made its rise from Chapter 61 of the Magna Carta, even though the right to petition is not in the Magna Carta. The Charter alone is an example of the right. The Charter begins a practice that colonists and later U.S. citizens will use as an example. Allowing individuals to exercise this right has led us to understand the freedom of association. In Hughes versus CIO, the freedom to assemble in a public forum was ruled privileged inheritance by the Constitution and thus incorporated.
Movements like the women's right and the civil rights have exercised their First Amendment rights in order to make change in our society. The women's right movement used specifically the right to associate, assemble, and petition. Leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, Lucy Stone, and Alicia Stone Blackwell formed various groups to support the same common right, the right for women to vote. The National Association of Colored Women, the National Women's Suffrage Association, and the National Women's Trade Union and created organization Women's and Demand Changes. The women's suffrage led to the adding the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote.
The Civil Rights Movement utilized the First and 14th Amendment, demanding the equal treatment by government officials and protections by the Constitution towards all citizens, regardless of race or color of skin. People like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Fred Shuttleworth, and John Duffy organized gatherings in order to build community support. As the movement began to grow, groups like the NAACP, SNCC, SCLC were formed against oppression and protection in many states. It is in the NAACP versus Alabama that the court first recognizes the freedom of association, and Nat Allen from the University of Pennsylvania quoted, quote, "The constitutional rights of speech and assembly include the rights of private groups association," unquote. The Civil Rights Movement led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Affirmative Action.
These changes did not come without the support of the judicial branch. Under the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court has been able to incorporate many areas of the Bill of Rights into the states. Cases like DeJong versus Oregon incorporated the freedom of assembly, but creates a set of regulations to the right, making gatherings peacefully, and the citizens may not riot or block the streets. In Cox versus New Hampshire, the court limited the right, establishing the time, place, and manner of how public assembly takes place, and giving government the responsibility to ensure citizens and protected both demonstrators and spectators. Court case Gregory versus Chicago ruled that the police should have done more to protect the marchers. Court ruled in Scout versus Dell that the First Amendment right of Boy Scouts to prevent gay men from becoming Scoutmasters.
The right to petition made its own limitations, since a petition is a request to the government and not guaranteed that the government will listen. For example, the Occupy Wall Street protest, and people believe that they are using the right to petition, assemble, and speech. Nevertheless, all cities require a permit to assemble. The Occupy movement going on recently around many cities in the nation have been a perfect example of this concept. Nevertheless, their protests must follow city regulations, like in the Occupy Denver, and their conflict with the city of Denver. Thank you. We are ready for follow-up questions.
The assembly of persons to engage in civil discourse, which was at the heart of the concerns of the Founding Fathers, and was deemed essential, as you pointed out in your very first comments, to full participation as citizens, essentially allows people to publicly promote an idea. In NAACP versus Alabama, the group was ruled entitled to remain anonymous with regard to their membership list for fear of retaliation by Alabama officials. How do you reconcile the two? How can I promote an idea without publicly standing behind it and yet engage in civil public discourse to exercise popular sovereignty. Are those two mixed, or are they in conflict? Please tell me.
I believe that they're mixed because some people use them as to when they want to associate with a group, they don't go around telling everybody that they're associating with that group specifically. They just keep it to themselves in order to not be judged in other ways.
You?
What about use of, Facebook and Twitter and the internet to do these polls and stuff? Do you think if people sign an internet petition, does that have the same force as if people go out across the street in front of the Capitol and stand and say, we're going to occupy Denver?
Could you rephrase that question?
So right now with the internet, people can get online and find out what's happening around the world. And sometimes people will sign petitions saying, I agree, I disagree with what's happening. Do you think getting, say, 1 million signatures via the internet is as powerful as getting, say, 1,000 people to stand out in front of the Capitol? Or do you think they're equal? Or do you think one vehicle is more powerful than the other?
I think standing outside of the protesters outside the Capitol would be stronger than the internet, because the internet, not that many people are viewing. Let's say someone that doesn't have an internet, they won't be able to see how many people are actually doing it, because some people could make up names, go on as many times, and you won't actually know the exact number of how many people are against that cause. And if you go out in the Capitol, you can actually see the people, and you can see what they would do in order to pass a certain movement.
I also agree with my colleague Fernando. I think if it is over the internet, that it could be very corrupt. He said also with people coming in as others that aren't necessarily themselves, and you can't really put a face to that. But when you stand outside the Capitol, then you can put a face to that.
Adding to what Fernando said, I think it does have a greater impact if you're personally, physically there, because it's harder to ignore. When you want them to realize that you really want this to get done, you want them to actually pay attention. As for a petition, they can easily just set it aside and not even look at it.
I want to change the topic a little bit. You guys did a pretty good job of talking about limitations, time, place, and manner. Recent cases of Westboro and Phelps talked about petitioning of a military funeral. Can you guys talk a little bit about the time, place, and restriction, or were there time, place, and restrictions in that case? Meaning, can I protest a military funeral? If I can, are there any restrictions?
Well, the only restriction that there would be that they would just have to get a permit. They would have to know exactly when and where, and the cause is pretty obvious. They want to make a funeral, and I think that's pretty appropriate.
So, as long as I get a permit, I can protest inside the church?
No. You may not protest inside the church. There's certain restrictions. That's one of the limitations. That's exactly why.
So there's more than just one. There's more than just one.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's why there's a place where you can do it.
Okay.
And that's why it's one of the limitations is time, place, and manner. So you cannot just go into a church and say, and start yelling something.
Okay.
No.
I think that
I was thinking about doing that later. You said there was only one. I was like, cool. I'm going to church.
I also believe that there should be respect paid to actual family and to religion, since in the Constitution, and it says that religion and state are separate, not together. So there should be that type of restriction also.
Let me take you back to the assembly part of your question. We are now a country 300 million strong. It's highly unlikely that a significant percentage of our citizenry could gather in one spot. And that takes me back to the question that was asked by my colleague about the impact of technical communication, which allows, subject to its faults, communication among a wide variety of people in a wide variety of places. Would the Arab Spring have been possible without modern communicative technology?
Do you know what the Arab Spring is? I didn't know until last week either, so it's okay. The uprisings within the Arab countries, like Egypt and the Middle East, where the government regimes were toppled essentially by the uprising of the people who came together.
They don't have time to respond. Unfortunately, you're out of time. But it's a great question for your thought down the road. How do 300 million citizens communicate with each other, if not through modern technological advances? Let me say you did a good job. I really appreciate the work you put in this semester and the fact that you know as much as you know. I thought you did a good job of covering a couple of essential cases. The reference to Lynn Armonk was surprising to me. I was surprised you knew that, and good for you. Hughes versus CIO, which is excellent. I believe it's cited in your text. I'm not sure, but I believe it is. Getting over to women's suffrage, at that point in time, I might have asked you to make reference to the Seneca Falls Convention, which was really the declaration of the women's suffrage movement. Great on permits. I love the fact that you cited the NAACP case. I talked about the advances made by the civil rights movement simply by assembly and petition. The Magna Carta was a great reference, and you knew the specific section. I appreciate the fact that you took the time to learn that. That's impressive. I really wish we could have gotten into the impact on technology. Not a problem. I was interested in the fact that you brought up Dale versus Boy Scouts. Interesting case. I don't remember the question there was whether or not they had the right to assemble and petition. And of course, it was who gets to be a Boy Scout leader, and is it okay for the Boy Scouts of America to discriminate against homosexual individuals? And of course, we know what the ruling was: a private organization, no state action involved, and if they want to state their preferences with regard to that issue, that was up to them, according to the court. But it is essential that there was no state action involved. Otherwise, I think the ruling would have gone the other way. But again, thank you for your hard work. I really appreciate you doing that. You will become the backbone of our democracy, the enlightened citizen. And I congratulate you for that.
Thank you.
I was really impressed with your intro. I was really impressed with the participation. Everybody participated. Everybody had good things to say. Everybody demonstrated really good knowledge. Really like you guys were one of the few groups and only groups to actually mention Occupy Denver, Occupy New York, what's going on. That was really good. Some, technology questions are hard. I mean, you guys are a technical generation, and you guys tend to do a lot more than our generations in talking without actually you talking. So that's kind of the new frontier of where petitions and assemblies are going. And I think if you guys get back to school and are able to Google the Arab Spring, it wouldn't have happened without technology. The countries were pretty impressive in the assemblies, and people found technical ways around that. It was pretty impressive about people's will to assemble and have freedom. So some things to improve on. You guys showed a great knowledge about the subject matter, but remember to use that when you're answering the questions. So don't abandon it and immediately go, well, let me tell you what I feel. I feel that everybody should be able to walk around in sandals all day. Stick with all the knowledge that you guys have ascertained. So good job.
Now, I think it is only appropriate that we recognize someone who helped you get where you are and planted the seeds for your future growth as citizens. Let's recognize